The Argonne Forest, October 8, 1918. Just after 7 in the morning, and a cold gray light filters through the shattered trees while the ground is slick with mud and frost. A young corporal from the mountains of Tennessee is pinned in a shallow ravine, 9 of his friends already dead in the wet grass beside him, machine guns hammering the hillside above him, his rifle empty and his hands shaking. And then 6 German soldiers rise out of a trench and charge him with fixed bayonets 20 yards away, then 15, then 10. He does not run, and instead he reaches for the pistol on his hip. What happens in the next few seconds will become one of the most famous moments in American military history. But the weapon in his hand is the real story here, not the man, the machine. Because that pistol was already being called old-fashioned before this war even started, with critics saying it was heavy and clumsy, a relic of a slower age, and some said the whole idea of a pistol on a modern battlefield was finished. And yet, that same overlooked, dismissed, written-off sidearm would go on to serve the United States military for the next 70 years, through 2 world wars, through Korea, through Vietnam, through the jungle and the desert and the frozen ridgelines of a dozen conflicts, longer than almost any weapon America has ever fielded. This is the story of the pistol they kept trying to replace and never could, the Colt M1911. To understand why this weapon lasted so long, you first have to understand the problem it was born to solve, and that problem started with a failure, a humiliating one. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States Army was fighting a brutal war in the Philippines, where American soldiers found themselves up against Moro warriors, fighters of extraordinary courage and ferocity, who would charge straight into gunfire with blades in their hands. And the Army's standard sidearm, a revolver chambered in a cartridge called the .38 Long Colt, was letting them down, because officers filed report after report saying the same thing, that they were shooting charging men, hitting them, and the men were not going down. General Leonard Wood put it plainly in a report from 1904, writing that natives had been shot through and through several times with a .38 caliber revolver and had kept coming, while a larger, older .45 caliber revolver, he said, stopped a man in his tracks. Now here is where we have to be honest with you, because most retellings of this story get it badly wrong, since you will hear that the M1911 pistol was invented to beat the Moros, and that is a myth. The pistol you are watching this video about did not even reach the Philippines until around 1913, when that conflict was already ending, and the guns actually used in those jungle fights were old revolvers and pump shotguns, with the shotgun, loaded with buckshot, being the weapon that genuinely turned the tide up close. So the Moro campaign did not create the M1911, but it did create something more important, a conviction burned into the mind of the United States Army that its next pistol had to hit hard, that it had to be a .45. In 1904, the Army ran a series of tests to settle the question of caliber once and for all, led by an infantry officer named John Thompson, a name you may know from a very different weapon he would later invent, and by a medical officer named Louis Lagarde. The tests were grim because they fired different cartridges into live cattle and into human cadavers at a Chicago stockyard, trying to measure what they called stopping power. The science was shaky and, honestly, by modern standards, it was almost worthless, and the results were inconsistent. But the board reached a conclusion the Army wanted to hear, deciding that a service pistol bullet should be no smaller than .45 caliber. That single decision set everything else in motion, and it brought a legendary name into the story, John Moses Browning. Browning is, without exaggeration, the most important firearms designer in American history. Born in Ogden, Utah, in 1855, the son of a frontier gunsmith, he built his first working firearm at the age of 13, and over his lifetime, he would register 128 patents covering more than 80 separate firearms, including the lever-action rifles of the Old West, the automatic shotgun, the Browning automatic rifle, and the .50 caliber machine gun that still serves today, all of them from the mind of this one quiet man. And when the Army went looking for a new .45 caliber automatic pistol, Browning was ready, and working with the Colt Company, he designed a cartridge to match the Army's demand, the .45 ACP, and a pistol built around it. But a good design on paper means nothing, and the Army was about to put it through one of the most punishing trials any weapon has ever faced. By 1910, the field had narrowed to two finalists, Browning's Colt and a competing pistol from the Savage Company, and to choose between them, the Army devised a torture test in which each pistol would fire 6,000 rounds, and when the guns grew too hot to touch, they were simply dunked in water to cool and then fired again. Browning himself attended the trial, and his pistol did something almost unheard of, because the Colt fired all 6,000 rounds without a single malfunction, not one stoppage and not one broken part, while the Savage, by comparison, suffered 37 stoppages and multiple breakages. There was no argument left to have, and on March 29, 1911, the United States Army formally adopted it as the automatic pistol, caliber .45, model of 1911, with the Navy and the Marine Corps following 2 years later. So what exactly had Browning built? On the surface, it was a slab-sided steel pistol, a little over 8 inches long, weighing about 2.5 pounds empty, and it held 7 rounds in the magazine with room for 1 more in the chamber. But the genius was inside. It used a principle called short recoil operation, so that when you fire, the barrel and the slide recoil backward together, locked tight for just a fraction of an inch, and then the barrel tilts down and unlocks. The slide keeps traveling back to eject the empty case, and a spring slams it forward again, stripping a fresh round into the chamber, all of it happening in a heartbeat every single time. It was rugged, it was simple to strip down and clean in the field with no tools, and it was forgiving of dirt, mud, and neglect, which matters more than almost anything else when the man carrying it is exhausted, terrified, and 1,000 miles from a workbench. If you are enjoying this deep dive so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep making them. And now, back to the story. Because a weapon is only truly tested in one place, in combat, and the M1911 was about to be tested in the worst war the world had ever seen. When America entered the First World War in 1917, it owned only about 75,000 of these pistols, nowhere near enough, so Colt and a company called Remington UMC raced to build more, turning out over 600,000 before the war ended. And it was in the final weeks of that war, in the Argonne Forest, that the pistol earned its legend, which brings us back to that Tennessee corporal in the ravine. His name was Alvin York, and on October 8, 1918, German machine gun fire had torn through his patrol, killing 9 men and leaving York, a devout Christian who had once tried to avoid the war on religious grounds, in command of the survivors. York began picking off the German gunners with rifle fire, one by one, and then came the moment that made history, when a German officer led 5 men in a bayonet charge straight at him, 6 men in all, and York drew his M1911 and shot them down. And here's the chilling detail he recorded himself, that he shot them from back to front, taking the rear man first so the men in front would not realize what was happening and would keep coming. And he said it was the way you shoot wild turkeys back home. By the end of that action, the German commander surrendered, and York and a handful of men marched 132 prisoners back to American lines, and he received the Medal of Honor. But because accuracy is what we do on this channel, you deserve the fuller truth, because for decades, films and even statues showed York using a bolt-action Springfield rifle, while the evidence, including a forensic study of the actual battlefield, points instead to a rifle called the M1917 Enfield. And that famous pistol duel turns out to be even more interesting, because modern archaeology at the site recovered fired .45 caliber cases from not one pistol but 2, since a soldier named Percy Beardsley was firing his .45 right alongside York. It takes nothing away from York's courage, but the real history is a team of desperate men rather than a lone superhero. And the pistol was there, and it worked. And that part is beyond dispute. After the war, the Army refined the design based on hard lessons from the trenches, because soldiers with smaller hands had struggled with the grip. So in the 1920s, a series of small changes were made, including a shorter trigger, a curved mainspring housing at the base of the grip, a longer spur on the grip safety to stop the slide from biting the web of the hand, and little scallops cut into the frame behind the trigger. None of it touched the internal mechanism, and the guts of Browning's design were left exactly as they were, because they were already perfect. This updated version was called the M1911A1, and it would carry America through its next and greatest trial. The Second World War consumed the M1911A1 on a scale that is almost hard to imagine, because the Army needed millions of them, and Colt alone could not possibly keep up. So the contracts went out to an astonishing collection of American companies, most of which had never made a gun in their lives. The single largest producer was not a gun maker at all, but Remington Rand, a company that built office typewriters, and from its plant in Syracuse, New York, it turned out more than 1 million pistols, over half of all wartime production, and it did so at the lowest cost of any manufacturer, building nearly 560,000 of them in 1944 alone. A gun company called Ithaca built around 340,000, and a railroad signal company called Union Switch and Signal built about 55,000 before being switched to other war work. And then there's the most famous footnote in the pistol's entire history, because the Singer Company, the sewing machine maker, was given a small trial contract and produced just 500 pistols, after which Singer's incredible precision was redirected to building artillery sites and bomb sites, work considered even more vital. Those 500 Singer pistols are today among the most valuable military firearms on the planet, and a single genuine example can be worth more than a house. Across the whole war and the decades around it, more than 2.7 million of these pistols were built for the American military, and they went everywhere, into every theater and every branch, in the hands of pilots, tank crews, military police, paratroopers, and generals, until the pistol became as much a part of the American soldier as his boots. And it did not stop when the war did, because in Korea, the pistol was there again, and when a Marine lieutenant named Henry Comiskey charged a machine gun position near Yeongdeung-po in 1950, he cleared it with his automatic pistol and earned the Medal of Honor, while a famous Army analyst who studied the fighting in Korea found that soldiers valued the pistol there even more than they had in either world war. In Vietnam, it went into the tunnels, because the soldiers who crawled into the pitch-black Viet Cong tunnel networks, the men called tunnel rats, often carried a .45 since it was compact, powerful, and utterly reliable in the mud and dark, and air crews carried it, and special forces carried it, and many of the very guns they carried were the same worn steel pistols that had already seen Normandy and Iwo Jima and Incheon. So how did one design last so long? To really appreciate it, you have to compare it to what everyone else was carrying. Its most famous rival was the German Luger, and later the Walther, which were beautiful, precise, superbly engineered pistols. And we should be fair, because the German designs were often more accurate on a target range, and the Walther pioneered a clever double-action trigger that the American gun simply did not have. So in pure mechanical elegance, the Germans had real advantages. But elegance is not the same as endurance, because the German pistols were more complex, more sensitive to dirt and cold, and more expensive to build, while the American .45 was the opposite, a sledgehammer next to a scalpel, and it did not care about mud, and it did not care about freezing rain or desert sand, because it did one thing, and it did that one thing forever. And that, in the end, is the whole secret, because the M1911 was never the most refined pistol in the world. It was simply the one you could always, always count on, and in a business where a jammed weapon means a dead soldier, reliability beats beauty every time. Now, we promised you 70 years, and we owe you the honest arithmetic, Because the M1911 served as America's standard sidearm from 1911 until 1985, when the military finally adopted a new 9mm pistol, the Beretta M9, and that is 74 years at the top, and even then it refused to truly die. Why did it finally get replaced? Not because it failed, but because of the aging inventory, the desire to standardize on the 9mm cartridge used by America's NATO allies, and, in the end, simple cost, because when the Beretta and a pistol from SIG both passed every reliability test in the 1980s trials, the Beretta won largely because it was cheaper. But here is the twist that proves the point, because even after 1985, the elite refused to give it up, and Marine Special Operations units kept hand-building custom 45s from old frames well into the 21st century. And as recently as 2012, Colt won a fresh contract to build a modernized 1911 for Marine Special Operators, a design from the age of biplanes still going to war, alongside the most advanced soldiers on Earth, a full century after it was born. One more thing before we close, because it is the myth we most need to bust, since you will hear endlessly that the 45's stopping power was magic and that it could knock a man off his feet, when the truth, according to the FBI's own modern research, is that handgun stopping power is largely a myth and that no pistol cartridge physically knocks anyone down. The 45 was a fine, effective cartridge, but the pistol's true greatness was never really about the size of its bullet. It was about the fact that it went bang every single time you pulled the trigger for 70 years. So let us go back to that cold morning in the Argonne, to a frightened young man in a muddy ravine, reaching for the pistol on his hip as the bayonets close in. He did not reach for the newest weapon, or the fanciest, or the most beautiful. He reached for the one that would not fail him, and it did not. That was the whole promise of the M1911. Not that it was the best pistol ever made, only that when everything else had gone wrong, when the rifle was empty and the enemy was 10 yards away and closing, it would still be there, and it would still work. They called it forgotten, and they called it obsolete, and it outlasted nearly every weapon that was ever built to replace it. The truest weapons are not the ones that impress you on a good day. They are the ones that never let you down on the worst one.